A medieval castle, built not to house royalty or repel invaders, but to seal something away. Beneath its chapel floor lies a pit so deep and dark the locals swore it led straight to hell. This is the legend of Houska Castle, a fortress raised to contain the underworld itself. To understand why the castle was built, we must go back to the day a man went hunting in the woods and returned with a story no one wanted to believe. My name is Aurielis. I'll be your guide through the strange, the legendary, and the mysterious. The library is open. Let's begin the tale. Radek carefully nocked an arrow and silently began to pull back on his bowstring. His eyes were focused on the plump rabbit in front of him, rooting around on the forest floor for tender grasses hidden in the fallen leaves. Just as Radek was ready to loose his arrow, a strange and haunting howl erupted in the trees to the right of him. The rabbit took off into the forest, and the hunter immediately dropped to one knee on the ground and trained his bow at the source of the sound. The hair on Radek's neck and arms were standing on end. He had never felt so much terror in his life. In all his years of hunting in this forest, he had never heard such a horrific sound, and he had never felt so much primal terror. He had encountered wolves and bears and wild hogs, but none had ever had such an effect on him. Radek did his best to breathe quietly, but the fear began to overtake him as he heard rustling in the trees beyond him. Whatever it was coming closer. Radek felt cold sweat drop down his face, and he felt the strength in his arm begin to fail as he tried to hold back the bowstring. He knew he could not hold on much longer and made the decision to fire the arrow towards the sound of whatever was coming toward him. The arrow whistled through the branches of the trees, and the hunter heard the sound of a thud and rustling as it hit something in the wood. The sound of the creature coming toward him stopped for a second, and then he heard the sound of it running towards the location of where the arrow had landed. Radek was panicking at this point, and as he heard the creature moving away from him, he quickly turned and began to run in the opposite direction. Branches tore at his body as he ran, ripping both clothing and flesh. Suddenly, Radek stopped. A cliff stood before him, made of limestone. He knew this cliff, but something had changed. A large crack or a pit was now in the cliff that hadn't been there before. Though it was strange, he saw it as an opportunity for a place to hide. He ran toward the pit and stopped at the edge. Frigid air blasted him as he looked down into the inky darkness below. He could not make out the bottom, and so dropped a small rock near him into the pit. Silence. No sound reached his ears of the rock hitting the bottom. Confused, he dropped another, and still there was silence. And then he heard it. Strange whispers in a language he could not quite make out. They began softly, and then became louder, and louder, and louder from the pit. Radek backed away quickly and began running away into the woods. Eventually, an exhausted Radek was found by the local priest as he had made it back to the village and collapsed in front of the local church. At first, the locals did not take Radek's story seriously. They had hunted this forest for generations, and no such thing was part of the local legends. Rumors spread of the hunter, and his story was discounted due to his extensive history of drinking. But that didn't last long. Soon, local farmers began to complain of livestock going missing overnight. At first, the villagers believed it was a band of wolves and decided to stake out the fields. That was when things took a turn for the worst. The next morning, the lookouts did not return, and when they were searched for in the light of the new day, what was found was horrifying. The men had been ripped to shreds by some strange beast. Panic quickly spread through the village at this new development. After some frantic searching, one of the lookouts was found alive, hidden in a barn. Shaking, he told the others that monsters had come out of the forest, twisted devils with wings and eyes like flame. They moved with speeds that didn't make sense and ripped the lookouts apart with claws like daggers. The villagers spent the next few days in terror, as more stories from survivors were told of the creatures and the pit in the limestone cliff that they seemed to be coming from. A band of brave villagers decided the best course of action was to travel to the nearby town where the Duke resided. They needed help. They needed soldiers. After a lot of begging and the cashing in of old favors, the band of villagers were able to secure an emergency meeting with the Duke. They told him everything that had happened and pleaded for the Duke's help. The Duke sat back in his chair and stroked his beard. He had never heard of such a tale. However, he knew that if he did nothing, the panic would soon spread across his domain. His people were known to be superstitious. The Duke and a band of his men went back to the village to investigate. He thought it likely that the monster was actually a regular animal like a bear or wolves. The Duke's men searched the woods and had lookouts overnight to see if any monsters descended from the forest. However, nothing happened. No sign of any monster or normal predator had been found. Eventually, they traveled to the limestone cliff to investigate the strange pit. The Duke waited to hear any whispers or strange sounds, but again, nothing happened. At this point, the Duke was annoyed at the lack of evidence for what the villagers had reported to him so urgently. It felt like a waste of his time. As he and his men prepared to leave the villagers began to plead again with the Duke to please help them. One of the Duke's men came up with an idea. What if they lowered someone into the pit to prove that there was nothing abnormal about it? This could alleviate the fears of the villagers and prove that nothing supernatural was going on. The Duke hastily agreed, wanting to solve this quickly so he could return home. Knowing that it was going to be very difficult to find someone willing to be lowered into the pit, the Duke made a deal with a few prisoners who were expected to be hanged for various offenses in the coming weeks. If they would agree to be lowered into the pit, the Duke would spare their lives. 3 men agreed to this deal. The first to be lowered was a young man who had attempted to steal a horse from a guardhouse. His mother had helped to convince him to be lowered into the pit to save his life. She watched anxiously as the Duke's men tied a rope around his waist. Slowly, he was lowered into the pit. Every few seconds, they called down to him, and he would yell back, his voice echoing against the limestone walls of the dark pit. Down and down he descended. There didn't appear to be an end to the darkness. The Duke's men were beginning to run out of rope. All of a sudden, the young man began to scream. The men holding the rope were lurched forward as the young man thrust wildly at the other end. The young prisoner's mother begged and screamed for them to pull him up. The Duke ordered for the men to do so quickly. All the while, the young man screamed and screamed. Horrible, blood-curdling screams. He sounded like some kind of animal, inhuman. Finally, the prisoner was brought up to the edge of the pit, and the Duke's men grabbed his arms and pulled him out. The man's mother screamed again as she saw his face. The man who trembled on the ground before them was no longer young. He appeared 30 years older, was gaunt, and had white hair. The man could no longer speak, and the only sounds he made were quiet whimpers. The 2 other prisoners refused to be lowered into the pit after seeing this, and the group hastily retreated back to the village. A few days later, the man died from unknown causes and had been unable to tell anyone what he had seen. The Duke quickly contacted the king and told him of what was happening in the forest. After meeting with his advisors, the king decided to begin a project to ensure that the pit was sealed forevermore. Houska Castle was built in the Czech Republic in the second half of the 13th century by King Ottokar II of Bohemia. It lies about 29 miles north of Prague. Ownership of the castle has changed hands a few times throughout history and has gone through periods of disrepair and renovations. The first question that arises is, why was the castle built in the first place? Building a castle takes time and is very expensive. Normally, castles are built for defensive purposes, to protect the nobles or citizens of an area. However, Houska has no external fortifications for defense. What defenses it does have were built facing inward, not to protect from without, but within. The original castle was built without a kitchen, and its only source of water is a cistern that collects rainwater. If you look up to the upper floors, there appear to be windows, however, these are actually fake. They are blocked from the inside by thick walls. Additionally, the original builders did not even build stairs from the courtyard to the upper floors. The story we explored at the beginning is inspired by a version of the local legend surrounding the castle. It has been believed for centuries that the castle was constructed specifically to seal the pit and prevent demons from climbing out from hell and into our realm. It is said that the castle's chapel was built directly over the pit and was dedicated to the archangel Michael. Michael is the angel from Christianity who is believed to have fought Lucifer and his fallen angels. He is still called on by Christians in the present day with the St. Michael prayer to protect them from the devil and his evil spirits. Although the chapel is Christian and has Christian symbols, it also has some pagan artwork. This can seem unusual at first glance, however in my research I found that it was actually not uncommon for Christian artists in the Middle Ages to mix pagan and Christian art together to symbolize moral conflicts or the supremacy of the church over older belief systems. A good example of this is the Karja church in Estonia that was built in the 14th century. It has depictions of devils and pentagrams in stone and in mural form. Houska Castle was built a century before Karja and has murals that depict dragons and demonic creatures. It also has a painting of a female centaur archer, which, interestingly, the centaur uses its left hand to shoot the arrow, despite left-handedness being considered sinful and associated with the devil in the Middle Ages. This artwork could be a homage to the creatures that lurk beneath the church, or this artwork could symbolize other moral teachings or beliefs of the time. As far as other architectural curiosities, for the castle's official website, there are many underground passages and hidden spaces in the castle's basement, where skeletons of non humans or demonic beasts are supposed to be buried. The location where you could enter these passages was allegedly marked above the castle gate, which unfortunately no longer exists. The castle's lore has attracted various types of people throughout its history who believe they could harness the potential power from the pit of hell for themselves. One of these people, according to legend, was a mercenary named Oronto. He allegedly took up residence in the castle in the 1600s with the goal to harness the dark power of the pit to create alchemical solutions to achieve immortality. His habits and his work frightened the inhabitants of the nearby villages so much that one night two hunters supposedly ended up murdering him. Also, in 1836, a poet, Karl Heinrich Maka, allegedly stayed the night in the castle and reported to his friend in a letter that he had a vision or a dream where he found himself transported into the future. In the dream, he said his soul descended into the pit and was transported to the year 2006. He said he met a girl who showed him moving pictures in a small casket, which sounds like he could have been attempting to describe a cell phone. And in darkness, he walked along high sandstone cliffs that had many holes that projected an eerie yellow light. Some have drawn the connection as describing apartment buildings that are on the outskirts of the city today. According to an article from Sky History, the Nazis occupied Houska during World War II following the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938. Houska Castle was taken over by the Wehrmacht, who occupied the building until 1945. During that time, locals claimed to have heard strange noises and to have seen bright lights coming from the castle. This led to the belief that the Nazis were conducting occult experiments and were possibly even trying to open the pit to hell in order to weaponize what lay beneath. It is unclear exactly what the Nazis got up to in Houska Castle, as all records of their activities there have either been lost or destroyed. Theories range from them using it as a base to conduct experiments testing paranormal weapons, to them using the castle as a breeding center for super soldiers. You can actually visit the castle yourself today. It was opened to the public in 1999. Visitors to the castle report hearing inhuman screams and scratching sounds under the floor of the chapel as if someone or something was trying to break out. Locals who work nearby claim to have seen strange things and creatures in the woods around the castle, including winged creatures, half human, half dog beings. A worker who helped renovate the castle reported hearing a voice inside the walls of the chapel that spoke to him in an unknown language. And according to another legend, a figure in a black cloak and hood guards the castle and the surrounding grounds. It has no face and watches the guests who visit. It isn't described as malevolent, but acts as though it is just filling a role as a guardian or spiritual caretaker. Houska Castle has been featured in a few shows on the Travel Channel, on Ghost Hunters International, and was used as inspiration for a Doctor Who graphic novel. To this day, we don't really know why the castle was built or why it was constructed in such a strange way. All we have are the legends and stories that have been passed down for generations. We may never know the exact truth. However, let's hope the castle stands tall through the coming years just in case. And so we turn the page on Houska Castle, an enigma that has guarded us from evil for over 700 years. Until next time, we'll meet again soon, between the lines and between the worlds.